You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're joined by Oxford, Ohio City Councilor and Miami of Ohio Geography Professor David Prytherch. We chat about his new book, Reclaiming the Road, Mobility Justice Beyond Complete Streets. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super wonderful, terrific, amazing Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of city wizards and transportation experts, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. We've also got some bonus material up there, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, the heavyweight net bike scarf is back in stock. I'm also going to make a concerted effort to make some new designs, but if you want to get one of the Buster Bike scarves or the Lightweight Bike scarf now, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. And if you'd like to support the show in other ways, you can buy books at the bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire, or find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarcholesterol. For anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook, visit theoverheadwire.com and definitely sign up for the almost 20-year-old daily newsletter. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that too. You can also find us on Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's Transit Nerds. Some great stuff coming up, so keep on listening and enjoy the show. A quick note for Patreon supporters. I've set up an ad-free podcast RSS feed at Patreon. This means if you want to listen to the show without ads or promotional episodes in your podcatcher of choice, you can do so by heading over to your Patreon account and getting the feed there. I'll post instructions in the show notes of how to do it. And if you aren't a Patreon supporter, you can do so by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Even just $1 a month gets you our podcast free of outside ads. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. David Prytherch, welcome back to the Talking Headways podcast.
It's such a pleasure to see you again, Jeff. Thank you so much for hosting me and all that you do with the Overhead Wire and the podcast. So thanks for your service to knowledge and the discipline.
Oh, well, thank you for your service to knowledge and the discipline. Writing a book is no small feat, and we'll talk about that in a second. But before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about what you've been up to besides writing the book since we last chatted in 2021? I think it was episode 359.
Well, here we are at 500 and something. Yeah. So I've been continuing to do the same sort of thing. Big picture on me, which is that I'm a professor of geography at Miami University. I mainly teach urban planning and sustainability. I'm active on campus with things like climate action. I sit on most of the planning committees that one can sit on. I'm also an elected official. I'm a city councilor in the city of Oxford, and have 2 kids who are off to college. And yeah, just trying to make it through life in 2025. So that's a separate topic. But yeah, big picture, just really interested in places and how they come to be and how we can shape them. And I do that through teaching and research and public service.
That's a lot of hats. How do you kind of juggle all the hats and all the things that you do, from the research also to being a city councilor? That seems like a lot of reading and research as well.
Well, for me, when I first started doing this, they felt like things that pulled me in separate directions. You remember, like that was what the British Empire would do to people who draw and quarter them by pulling them in separate directions. But all of these things flow into each other for me. So the research that I'm doing, for example, on streets, it feeds into my teaching, and then it feeds into my service. I think, as I probably mentioned to you in 2021, I partly got into learning about traffic engineering so I could argue with my local engineer that, yes, the street was wide enough for a bike lane. And so there's a really nice kind of dynamic that goes between teaching and research and service. It's a lot of different hats, but it's all part of the same whole, which I really appreciate.
Is it hard to go into like a meeting with all of the knowledge that you have in the traffic engineering, urban planning space and stuff, and kind of go back to square one in terms of explanations or, traffic engineering 101?
Yeah, it's hard. And to be honest, people don't always welcome my expertise. They want to hear about it.
You're always an expert outside the city you live in, right?
Yeah. But this is, to me, I think the engineering part of it is pretty straightforward. Like, what's the range on a possible lane width on a street? 10 to 13 feet. But to me, what the research has helped me with is to boil it down to pretty basic principles like equity. That if we're going to repave the street and we have a complete streets policy, it's not right to not build a sidewalk. We have someone who's blind who lives in the neighborhood, and them walking in the street is not right. And so I try to keep it to that basic values level, and then the engineering flows from that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about your book, Reclaiming the Road, Mobility Justice Beyond Complete Streets. Where did the impetus for this one come from?
So it's really been interesting to talk about what I've been up to. It's been kind of my project over the last decade or so to understand how the geography of the public street came to be the way it was, which for me then became very much a study of the legal and the policy and the engineering frameworks that govern the street. And so that was my last book in 2018, Law, Engineering in the American Right of Way, was just trying to really critically analyze these important procedural and design frameworks through the filter of mobility justice, which ultimately became kind of an indictment of how bad that system is and how unjust it is. But I was kind of like, okay, that's enough on the transportation research for a while. And then 2020 happened. And the summer of 2020 was really a remarkable time. I had already seen, for example, that in my research that was focused on complete streets, the idea that streets should accommodate all users of all ages and abilities and all the different modes, to carve out some space for a bicycle lane or to make sure there were crosswalks. And that had been building up, but I've been able to see in the research that cities were starting to go beyond that. They were starting to do things like, parklets, that maybe a parking space wasn't just for transportation. It could be for public space, or cities like New York with Times Square and creating plazas. And so I'd seen some kind of nascent moves beyond simply redesigning the transportation system to accommodate users better to actually reclaiming the street as a public space. But those things were very limited prior to 2020. And then boom, 2020 happened. And all of a sudden, I just have this really strong memory of being in Boston in the North End, and the pedestrians and the restaurant spaces basically had taken over the streets, and the car was, God forbid you would try to drive down the street. They had completely flipped the script. And I saw cities all over in what seemingly the blink of an eye. New York converted 83 miles of streets into what they called open streets. Oakland, California closed something like 70 some miles of streets and called them slow streets. Parklets and the restaurant sheds just expanded. It was just this really remarkable thing. And I was so kind of blown away by it and really wondering a little bit that happened awfully fast. What were the planners thinking? Was that just, did they do it like that, or were they ready for this moment? So there was this radical, very sudden in the summer of 2020 reclaiming of the streets for something other than just transportation and beyond just alternative transportation. It was reclaiming the street as a public space the way we might have experienced it 110 or 120 years ago. So I felt like, okay, something new is going on there. But then the really remarkable thing is the summer 2020 was the summer of George Floyd, and a summer of incredibly robust conversations about equity in the United States. Again, which had been brewing for some time, including in the transportation space, where we had this complete streets movement that was saying, hey, to be fair, the street should balance all users. Then we started to have people saying, well, is that really enough? There are other equity issues beyond just whether you're a driver, a pedestrian, or a cyclist. What about gentrification, and how may a transportation improvement maybe perhaps impact kind of racial justice? And there was kind of a discontent that the complete streets movement, which mainly focused on intermodal equity, wasn't capturing all of the dimensions of equity. And then, of course, 2020 just blew that open, where we started really taking a hard look at equity and everything. And so just as fast as cities were moving to reclaim their streets, the Complete Streets Coalition, Smart Growth America, all of a sudden were incorporating new discourses of equity into their definition of complete streets by talking about historic patterns of disinvestment. And those two major forces, theoretical and practical, came together literally on the street space. I mean, George Floyd was killed on the street. Where he was killed became a public plaza. Black Lives Matter plazas. And so all of that stuff was going on, which to me was very, very interesting. But within that, I saw that there were some tensions that I myself, as a transportation advocate, was trying to struggle with. I'd always thought that bike lanes were good things. Creating a bike lane for a cyclist was good. That was moving towards transportation equity, and seeing the critiques that, oh no, a bike lane is a white lane, and that's part of green gentrification. I started to see that there were these kind of different equity conversations that seemed to be, either talking past each other or colliding. And as a person who is not only a geographer, but a planner, I know that decisions have to be made. Do you paint the bike lane or not? How do you allocate the street space? So I felt like there were all these different ways of talking about equity that didn't seem like they always jived with each other. And I conceptually needed to figure out, well, what would a just street look like if you had to do it and you had to make choices? How would you juggle these different axes? So my book is two things. One, it's an attempt to grapple with and create an intersectional idea of mobility justice that I hope would actually be workable, that you could actually try to juggle those different ways of thinking about equity. That's part of it. But then it's also to apply that to all these really what I thought were pretty interesting things that were happening on streets, like the slowing of streets or the closing of streets, or what we call open streets, or the plazification of streets. So lots going on in the book, but lots was happening in 2020 and in the year since.
There's so much, and there's so much of that to pull together, right? It's a really hard idea to construct some sort of argument around, it feels like. And one of the things that stood out to me from reading was just like this idea that streets aren't just a physical space, they're actually social constructs as well, right? So like we engineer them for traffic flow, but when we do that, what are we taking away? And so what does this look like 100 years ago before the cars were here? Was it more equal? There obviously were racial differences, like people's opinions about what should be in the street, commerce, etc. And so, looking back in time before the car, which makes our job a whole lot of a mess now, where do we stand even before cars came to bother us on our streets?
I think what's so interesting, and part of my project has been, and this is where the Peter Nortons of the world have been so helpful in helping us understand what happened to streets 100 years ago. They went from being social spaces that were relatively lightly regulated because they were understood to be public. And there were some norms, but it was the introduction of the automobile that led to a very codified, rule-based engineering of the space where it became infrastructure. And in becoming a highly engineered infrastructure, it wasn't just about that the street got paved and striped and all those sorts of things. Infrastructure is one of those things that kind of discursively we take out of the category of being social. Like as I was working with the last book, once you start thinking of the street as like a conduit for cars, you place a different set of expectations from the street that tend then to be technical. And so what's so powerful to me about what's happened in recent years is a kind of lowering of the veil, which is, okay, the street, yeah, it is infrastructure, but it is and always has been a public space. And so to look back at how did people share the street space 120 years ago, those norms have been forgotten because they're subsumed under this whole edifice of traffic engineering. But this is what the experiment of, for example, open streets, cities had to kind of rediscover, like, well, how do you juggle this stuff in what's ultimately a very amorphous space? The street, as we engineer it, okay, there's a lane for car and another lane for car and a bike lane, and everybody's got their space and it's orderly. The minute you kind of create, it's pedestrianized, but we're still letting bicycles through, and maybe we're letting slow cars through. It's probably not labeled and marked and divided and chopped up. It's then this organically shared space. It's really messy. And that's what I think cities have been trying to struggle with, is to relearn what some of that sharing was like from a social point of view that cannot be captured in signs and markings and statutes.
From like a neuroscience perspective, it's also interesting because people's brains basically break when you start to put in some of this chaos, or some of the perceived chaos, I should say, of putting in a bike in a place where people usually walk, or anything that might not be. And because they understand cars go here and pedestrians and everybody else go here. But then when you start mixing even more, it like people complain more about whether they're going to get run over by an e-bike than the tens of thousands of people that are killed by cars every year, right? So it's like this interesting neurological change in people's minds, and they can't quite put their heads around it because it doesn't make sense along the lines that they're used to.
It's really a powerful thing. And this is why I think that some of the stuff that I was studying in the book, and the whole range of ways that cities are reclaiming streets, but even those events that are ephemeral, one of the things that really paved the way for this a lot was the open streets, free streets, summer streets, which you close off streets for a weekend. They were ephemeral events, but there's something probably, and I'm not a neuroscientist, but cognitively powerful about walking down the middle of the street that used to be the domain of the car and experiencing it as something different. And so even though planners, for example, recognized that some of these interventions were not a full reclaiming of the street, I think they saw there was a lot of cognitive benefit to stepping off the curb and sharing the space in a new way. And yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there are neural pathways that need to form in order to be able to deal with that. But it's only by doing it that you can then see the world in a different way and then figure out how can I live with the e-bikes and the restaurant sheds and the delivery trucks. Sharing the city and its spaces is really hard. But we do it in other places. We've always had parks that were shared spaces, and we expect them to be somewhat messy and organic. And the street, I think we can learn to see it in that way also.
That kind of gets into the issue of belonging too, like who belongs in the street or who's allowed to be in the street. And I don't think you mentioned the veil of ignorance, but that's what you're referencing in the book. What's one of my favorite things that I've learned from Carol Martins and some of the stuff that's been out there recently is like this idea that if you have a desert island, for example, and you don't know whether you're rich or poor when you get to that desert island, like how would you set up your transportation system? You know, making sure like beforehand you set something up where you can thrive later on is a kind of a good proxy for figuring out whether it's fair or not for everybody. And so I think this idea of fairness, this idea of belonging is a really important point that you make in the book and begs the question like who belongs and who is this fair to when we're talking about streets and how their space is allocated.
Well, this is one of the things that I think we were talking about when we talked last time. I mean, I think geographers, for example, we talk a lot about the right to the city. And I think each of us from our own positions, we have a claim on the city, but we're not the only ones. There are different people in different modes of transportation, and there are people of different races and genders and economic statuses and from different neighborhoods. And so we all want and have a right to belong in the spaces of the city. So how do we make that fair? And as you know, one of those really great frameworks is to think about like via Rawls and kind of a political philosophy, this idea of the initial position of equality, or however he frames it, that at least in theory, you shouldn't be disadvantaged from the very minute that you enter the street. By this standard now, you enter the street as a bicyclist and right from the get-go, you're behind. I think that was a great kind of way to think about it. Some of those other frameworks are, as a geographer, distributional fairness. Do I have access to mobility? Does the network distribute mobility and the goods and bads of mobility equitably? You can look at the equity of sharing the street space, as I say, with go from the Google map view to the street view. At that level, is the public right of way divided up in a way that we can all access it and feel belonging there? Part of the wrestling with this is for many people, equity was about race and gender and national identity and full stop, which it does mean that, but then those things then intersect with, different people of different races are walking and driving and biking. And then you have all these other forms of equity that are place-based equity, the idea of gentrification. I think it's important to think about sustainability and intergenerational equity. Like, okay, so maybe we don't do a bike lane because we're worried about gentrification, but what does that do to the future person if we don't achieve decarbonization? And then there's procedural equity and all those things. So there's so many wonderful, wonderful ways to talk about equity, but they sometimes talk past each other. And my goal was to try to see if we can weave them together into one framework, which interestingly, we can talk later about that the planners, of course, are thinking about that stuff too. And they've created equity matrices that they're running projects through matrices that try to do this very thing, to try to weight the variable, to try to do the best they can.
That might be interesting too, because when we start to kind of systematize stuff, things can get lost in the wash. Like when we try too hard, almost sometimes we overdo it. We chatted with somebody recently that wrote a book, The Computable City, and they were talking about transportation models and how we've gone to computers to like try to figure out all these variables. And then in the end, humans make decisions irrationally sometimes. And so it's hard to say that like a model is actually the best way of going about it. And so there's positive attempts to make everything fair, and then like how much is going too far. It's an interesting kind of conundrum and question about the use of technology, which has its own biases.
Yeah, one of the kind of concrete examples of that I saw was one way to think about justice is kind of a procedural justice. For example, in the past, streets have been planned by traffic engineers, not very accountable to the public, and neighbors didn't have a lot of say. But what came out of some of these things, like something as simple as a speed hump or a slow street, cities started to open up to neighborhood requests that, hey, I've got a local street. I've got people speeding down it. Can I please get a traffic hump? Or can you do a slow street study here? Or, hey, I would like to have a parklet in front of my business. In New York City, the Open Streets program by neighborhood request. At one level, that's wonderful. It's so democratic to let the people say, hey, I want this in my neighborhood. But then you map that stuff and you realize that, oh, things that are voluntaristic, lo and behold, the people who ask for the resources are the people with the resources who know how to ask for resources. And so the map of open streets in New York City is a pretty stark map of where the business improvement districts are and where the active neighbors are. And so many of the cities I was talking to were backing away a little bit from that and to try to rely on data, because what on one level seemed equitable wasn't producing spatially equitable or racially equitable outcomes. And so they were trying to use mapping to identify where resources should go based on things like traffic accidents and age and race and income. And we're trying to some kind of hybrid of the two. And that's where, yeah, I guess I see the world like through the eyes of a planner who has X amount of resources and needs to allocate them. And do you do a bike lane or not? Which I think forces to articulate what your values are and operationalize them, which for critical geographers like myself, one could critique those things. But I think anybody who has to take an action, I have a lot of respect for their attempts to operationalize what they see as mobility justice through the allocation of resources and improvements across the city. And they'll admit it's a messy business.
Yeah, that's what I did, when I worked at my former job, is like data analysis of maps and locating resources and making typologies, right, of like where stuff should go. And so I love it, but sometimes it's almost like some of those best city in the world ranking systems where you're like, where's this come from? Like
by Wallet Hub.
Yeah, by Wallet Hub. Exactly.
It really was really interesting though, because I just had a really great conversation with a transportation planner in LA. And they just, for example, they found that a voluntaristic neighborhood requested slow streets program drained their staff resources because those people in the better off neighborhoods just took so much staff time to get it right. And other neighborhoods, to quote her, they would say, let us know when it's done.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a really very interesting. And I think that the planners were, again, simultaneously trying to redesign streets, which was an organic process, but they were also trying to redefine what equity was and apply it to streets, which again was messy.
The question I wrote down when I was reading the section of the book we were talking about is, what is the difference between procedural justice in creating equitable outcomes and, say, implementation of justice where the transportation is actually constructed? So that's that kind of edge between like the planning of it and then the decision making towards the construction of it, which I found very fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, there are just so many layers to how streets come to be in terms of the allocation of resources, thinking of them as networks that span metropolitan scale down to the level of inches and how people are engaged in the process. It's really complicated. But what I would say in general, one could critique the imperfections in that procedural justice. In all of this stuff, we need to compare it against what the norm is in the United States to the planning and engineering of streets, which is typically in terms of its justice, it's biased towards the automobile and unjust towards all other users. And procedurally, people don't often get a say at all. Engineers come in and they're kind of going to do what they're going to do on your street. And so what I was really struck by is the opening of a democratic space through all this. One of the things I found super interesting was by opening the street to a conversation about what the street could be, into that space came people, like a really classic example, people I spoke to, the 34th Avenue in Queens in New York, where they created an open street in the height of the pandemic. But that required, a lot of those cities right from the get-go, like we don't have the staffing to put up those barricades and take down those barricades every day. So people in the neighborhood rose up and organized to deploy barricades, which then led to the creation of what are now, I imagine, 501c3 groups like the 34th Avenue Open Street that have boards of directors. And there's a whole new political space that opened up by people who are charged with kind of organizing and thinking about and advocating for their streets that didn't really exist in that same way before. And I think just in the same way that if you step onto the street and get that sense of liberation, like, wow, like walking up the middle of the street feels really good. Like, I don't want to give that up. Actually having a say in the future of your street, being able to talk to the transportation agencies and say, no, what we want here is this, and that empowerment and the capacity building to know who to call and what to say and what to ask for was really kind of profound, I think, in terms of changing the dynamics of streets. And if we accept that they are public spaces, then they are political spaces. And we need to have a politics that can make decisions, that these are not just engineering decisions. Now, of course, that's really tricky. I mean, NIMBYism is tricky. Giving locals a say over their street is not always improved democracy. A whole other book one could write is the role of business improvement districts and business groups who stepped into this space and have run with it. I think that our cities are increasingly being planned by business improvement districts. And, one can have questions about how great that is.
I mean, I have a negative story about that. West Portal here in San Francisco, a family of 4 was killed, and the city started to think about, rethinking the street so that it's safer. And then the business district said no. And they had the ultimate decision for some reason. And it wasn't just like the business district, it was like who they appointed to the advisory committee that made the final decision to the supervisor that basically didn't move forward with as much of a change as people who are promoting safety wanted. And so that's a perfect example of what you're talking about.
But it can cut both ways. One of the things, if you talk to people like Robin Abad Ocovillo, who was involved in parklets in San Francisco prior to 2020, he said that every new parklet was a pitched battle against the businesses because they were afraid of parking being lost. The pandemic shifted the dynamic where all of a sudden the businesses were like, hey, that street space is maybe more valuable to be activated as outdoor cafe, and those cars can park somewhere else. And so they became a force, advocating for, the allyships that came out of in San Francisco, for example, like the Golden Gate Restaurant Association, I think it's called, wrestling with everybody. But it was really interesting because they were looking to create these shared spaces in San Francisco. And it turns out the fire department was the major impediment because the fire department didn't want anything that prohibited their ability to navigate. And so the Restaurant Association was kind of allied with those people who are trying to convert the streets into public spaces. I was thinking about the downtown San Francisco partnership. I can't remember the name of the streets, but with the loss of jobs downtown, they're trying to recreate a pedestrianized destination. And so for them, reclaiming streets was a really great economic development strategy. I have mixed feelings about it because when you think about the motordom, as Peter Norton would call it, has been such a monolithic force for dominating the streets. In the United States, what possible force could you imagine that would be a countervailing counterweight to motordom? And it might be the real estate industry. The real estate industry in the United States, real estate and cars, there probably are two. And so what's really played out was that capitalism saw the value of the street space and was happy to make a claim in it. Very complicated.
Capitalism or capitalists?
I don't know. Capitalists, downtown real estate interests. They were very happy to lease out street space for private enterprise, which is complicated.
Yeah.
And that, again, is one of those things that planners were trying to juggle, like really interesting stuff on the leasing rates, like what's an appropriate leasing rate for per square foot of the street. But I think, again, the planners are strategic people. I was talking to Jason Patton, he's a transportation planner in Oakland, and he was one of the primary people managing the Slow Streets program. He spoke about NIMBYism, like if you could harness NIMBYism as a force for progressive good. That, for example, NIMBYs don't love through traffic on their streets. Who does? And so if you can harness that local energy, that local interest in the street might help advance a citywide, bicycle boulevard agenda. So I guess the point is that streets are political spaces. And so far, the engineers kind of kept the politics were hidden inside the black box. But now that it's a little bit more out in the open, I guess at least you can see who the power players are. And you can have the conversation in a political arena and not hide it behind the obfuscation of engineering.
Direct quote from your book: a just street would allow democratic access along with transportation access.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I think that one of the most powerful things that engineers do is they make the conversation seem not like a democratic conversation, that it becomes a technical conversation. That we in the United States, when we call something infrastructure, we tend to defer to the experts. I find it the same with law, that case law is legible to anybody who can read English. You can read the law and understand it. You don't need a law degree, but there's certain things that we defer to the experts on. And I'm not saying that the average person should defend themselves in court or try to engineer a street, but I think the first thing we have to do is recognize that these processes should be open to public comprehension. We should have conversations about them in language that is not overly technical, that we should have processes. And, I really do credit planners with trying to do that. What they found sometimes is that too much democracy is not a good thing either. I mean, try to plan a bicycle network and you soon start to question how much democracy you should really afford. I mean, I will say this about the interstate highway system. If you asked each farmer along the route whether they wanted to contribute their land to the project, you wouldn't have it, So there's a tension there that I think cities are trying to work through. But I think there's more space for democracy in the planning the streets, much, much more space.
That gets into something else you read in a book about, is like the guides and the technical aspect of this. You praise NACTO for being more accessible from a layman's perspective. The guides are very easy to understand, got the nice pictures in them. But there's all these guides out there that are harder for people to kind of understand if you're going through them. They're also very expensive. I mean, the AASHTO bike guide is like, $350, $400, $500 or whatever, which I guess like a state highway department can afford, right? But it's hard for even somebody who's super interested in this to get a copy of the book.
Well, that's the thing. I could look it up. I think that price you quoted was probably for the PDF download. It's crazy. And so, yeah, for me to even to do this research, I'm trying to do interlibrary loan to get a copy of the AASHTO policy on geometric design, the Green Book, or trying to encourage my local engineer to buy it so I could borrow it. Right then and there, that tells you, I mean, there's a whole conversation we could have. And those manuals, those AASHTO manuals, AASHTO is not a governmental agency. AASHTO is a quasi public group. There's a whole critique one could make about how undemocratic that aspect of roadway design is. The manuals are put together not by democratically elected or appointed people. The manuals are written in a obfuscatory way. They are hugely expensive. And then the processes of the actual design of the street are typically pretty black box. I am a city councilor and I have such limited sway over the decisions that are made over the local streets because the engineers don't want to let me in. They don't want to let anyone in. They like to have discretion. So yes, I think there's a lot that can be critiqued also about NACTO, Michael Bloomberg's money. There's one could critique that. What I see in those manuals is they're all rooted in the accepted standards. Like when you open up the Urban Streets Design Guide, you're seeing what's permissible under AASHTO manuals made visible. Here's your current street. This is what the street could look like in the future. And then with all kinds of annotations about the standards, it's an incredible tool for opening up the conversation. And within those manuals, even though those manuals themselves have been pretty much traditionally just about complete streets, about bicycle lanes and things like that, but they also have opened up standards for parklets and standards for shared streets. And in a very, very quick, dynamic dialogue with practitioners. So they came out with a pandemic manual, the NACTO Guide to Pandemic Streets, I think in May or early June of 2020, put together very, very quickly, in part because shared streets and things like that were already in the manuals. But Oakland was testing out slow streets and NACTO is talking to practitioners. And so we talk about policy, mobility, and geography. Oakland was testing something which then became the model for the NACDO manual, the Pandemic Streets Manual, which then became the standard for cities across the United States, all in real time in a matter of weeks or months. So yeah, I mean, I think that mistakes will get made. I mean, I think engineers would hate that kind of rapid dynamic change,
Well, we were
but
talking to Bill, and it took him 10 years to write the next bike guide for AASHTO, right?
wow.
Like that's how long it took them to put it together. 10 years is a long time. I mean, think about 2014, and the iPhone was only out in 2009 or something like that, right? So
Yeah.
like think about how much changed since then.
Well, and these are very dynamic times. And that I think is a whole other theme, which was planners kind of universally saw a window of opportunity in the pandemic. That the pandemic, because it was kind of an emergency, suspended bureaucracy and enabled a certain amount of experimentation and innovation and speed that what I had hypothesized when I saw how quickly cities laid out all this stuff, I was like, wow, I bet the planners were ready for this moment. And in a way they were. They had been trying and trying and trying and trying and trying and making incremental progress. And they just, in summer 2020, a window opened up where the typical rules were suspended and they were given a green light to just innovate. And they did with incredible rapidity. I think, again, if you talk to them planners, much as they want to innovate, they too are methodical and mistakes were made. I mean, I think you talk to people like Jason Patton with the Oakland Department of Transportation, the speed with which they rolled out slow streets was too fast. And there were mistakes made that then they had to correct for in terms of doing something top down and not engaging residents. But that was so interesting in that moment because when I was researching the book, they were coming out of that emergency moment. And then the new rule systems were being codified, but differently than they were before. It was like a shift where it came in one way. There was a wide open window, but then these new norms were being codified that would then kind of clamp down and be durable again for the next 10 or 20 years. So to see experiments being turned into manuals as a geographer and a planner is really fascinating to see new social ideas articulated in new norms. Very, very interesting time to study. And even though some of those parklets have disappeared and some of those bike lanes have been ripped up and the shared streets, maybe not all of them are still there, the policies are now in place. And that's pretty powerful in the world of transportation planning and engineering to have codified standards that support doing these sorts of things.
When you're just chatting about how fast they did the Pandemic Streets Guide in 2020, I was thinking about like the Standard Zoning Enabling Act, putting that together and then having basically every city in the country over the next like 5-10 years adopt something like that. And then we have zoning. And then obviously that was too fast. And the reasons why they did it was not because of zoning necessarily. We had Yoni Applebaum on his book Stuck to talk about that specifically, but just the ability to get something done and fast, changed cities forever. And what's interesting about this time when it happened for the streets is that the cars slowly crept back in, right? It is like you got them out of the street. Certain streets were slowed down on streets, not even really kicking them out, but just slowing them down. And then slowly they reasserted themselves in the space, which is, interesting and also kind of a bummer for us who wanted to continue the slowness.
Yeah, it was a very interesting time. And even as I was writing it, it was uncertain where it would all go because what had been this kind of enthusiasm and this moment, I mean, it is a pretty profound thing when you have been struggling with busy through traffic on your street for decades. You've been begging for speed humps and not been getting them. And then all of a sudden, barricades are erected on your street and you can have a block party on your street. Like, what a feeling. I think that a lot of people had a sense of possibility, but the automobile is a pretty powerful force in American society, and drivers were not going to cede that space for that long before trying to make claims back on it again. And that's why a lot of these things, these barricades went up and then they came back down again for a lot of reasons. The traffic volume picking up, barricades, temporary solutions are very costly to transportation agencies, and they kept having to replace the barricades and they were getting moved, and transportation engineers want durable engineered solutions to things. And so maybe it'll all just go back to the equilibrium it was before, but I think that again, people got a window into something that they wanted to then hold on to, and they codified those things. And some people were really disappointed. I mean, to use that example of people in Oakland who had been begging for traffic speed humps, got a slow street, and then the city pulled it off. They're still begging for their traffic calming. And the city's kind of like, sorry, according to our equity matrices, your neighborhood really doesn't need it as bad as some other neighborhood does. And so I think anytime there's a moment, a window, and you can see a different kind of world that you want to look into it and peer into it. And pandemic was that, but I think the baseline shifted on some of these things. And in a way that I think about the street as territory. And I think a lot of people didn't think they had a stake in the territory. And I think that, for example, giving businesses and downtown real estate interests a stake in the street is like they've held on to that. And now they have a countervailing argument to parking, for example. Yeah, it's been really interesting. I don't know where it's all going to go, but I think just like when you walk down to the middle of the street and you're like, wow, it's amazing. Imagine if more streets were like this. I think what happened in 2020 is people started realizing how much real estate was in the public street. There's a lot of space there that we've been using for two purposes, primarily driving and parking. And I think that once people started dawn on them, like, oh, this is potentially usable, leasable space. I think that kind of thinking is hard to get out of your head, but we'll have to see where it all goes.
One customer versus 10, maybe something along those lines, and the magic numbers add up.
Yeah.
The other thing that you mentioned, having a stake was, cyclists and pedestrians felt like they finally had a stake in the street. And the one example from Pittsburgh where there was a person that says, if the city cares about it, then I feel as a cyclist or as a pedestrian like I belong there. Otherwise, I feel like I'm not welcome.
Well, that's the thing. I hesitate to liken streets to really serious movements like the civil rights movement, but we are talking about rights and justice. And I think the way oppression happens is you deny people, you deny them their rights, you deny them the ability to exercise their rights, or you convince them that they don't have rights at all and you might as well just live under subjugation. And that's how Jim Crow worked. But once you gave people the opportunity to vote, they were willing to risk water cannons to get to the polls or to exercise their rights. Cyclists and pedestrians, the street is also a space of rights. And again, I know it's not the civil rights movement, but it's a space that kills a lot of people. The street is a really dangerous place to exercise your rights as a pedestrian or a cyclist. And this is where, for me, the equity is about things like identity, like race. But to be a cyclist, whatever your race is to be subject to a power system that is really stacked against you. And the consequences are really high. I mean, they're life and death consequences. You ride a bicycle and here on my wrist, on my watch is my road ID. Because if I go out onto the roadway, I think there's a non-insignificant chance I don't come back. So to me, I feel like the politics of that is pretty serious. But yeah, I think once you've had a taste of what it's like to have a claim on the street, to have a voice, you're unlikely to give it up. All of a sudden you realize that, hey, I do deserve space on the street. Hey, I do deserve a seat at the table. And you're unlikely to give it back without a little bit of a fight. And so that's what I've seen in recent decades. Like, you live in a city with very, very robust bicycle advocacy. And one could critique that, bicycle advocates, not always the most diverse crowd, but compared to the vehicular interest, it's a different voice.
Going in a little bit of a different direction, one of the things that I've been talking about lately, and again, I started thinking about with your book, is the idea of needing more public sector capacity. You mentioned earlier the need for transportation departments to move barriers at the end of streets, at the end of a day or beginning of day, and all these, different organizations and such popping up. But I also took from that maybe we need the public sector capacity to be more equitable, in the sense that we need more people to organize the streets, maybe help design the streets that isn't just the traffic engineers, so that we can have more equitable space for people to organize and to transport themselves. So that was another thing that came up, was like, how much does public sector capacity impact what we can actually do in streets and how equitable they can be?
One of the really interesting things in kind of researching, the book was mainly about what happened in 2020 and the years following, but I try to do a bit of history on what cities have been doing. And one of the major things that had been happening in cities was the reorganization of transportation departments, where transportation departments were in public works. They were defined very narrowly. Many of these cities had created new departments of mobility and infrastructure, often now directed by people who were bicycle advocates, which to me, we're always trying to move ahead to get to the next frontier, but to have to rename your transportation department, your streets department, which was presumed vehicular, into a, Department of Mobility and Infrastructure, and then to appoint a bicycle advocate in charge of it was a pretty significant shift. And it's not going to say that those processes are very durable. Sometimes people write about infrastructure as being obdurate. The vehicular, that standard mindset of paving is really strong. But now you have someone at the top who could say, well, how are we budgeting our money? How do we allocate our staffing so we have more people dedicated to these programs? Yeah, I'm a city councilor, and so this wasn't in the book, but I'll share the anecdote. My city, we have a paving budget, $600,000 a year, and that paving budget is directed entirely towards making sure streets are smooth for cars. We have $50,000 allocated for pedestrian bicycle safety. It's not proportional to the amount. It's a college town, we should probably be allocating the resources proportional to the users, but we don't. One of the things that's interesting in what I was seeing and talking to planners, because I think planners generally they're thinking idealistically about, they're thinking about how the city could be, but they do have one foot in the pragmatics of how cities get run, how dollars get allocated, how staffing resources get allocated. And so what's been happening is the shift, it's still tilted towards the car. But I think this was also a moment where, cities like New York now have like public space. I'm trying to think of what Kyle Foreman's title is. He's like a public space advocate or something. And, the idea that you could create a staffing position inside a Department of Transportation dedicated to activating public spaces, that's a little different from how things were 20 years ago.
So from putting together the book, what stands out from all your research that you've done? Like, is there anything that felt like an aha moment? You've, studied this stuff for a long time. I imagine that some of it wasn't necessarily surprising, but is there anything that stuck out?
Well, I guess for me, even as someone who's thought about streets through the lens of public space and through the lens of equity and social justice, the standard hegemonic way of thinking about streets is still in our brains, maybe like you're saying in the neural pathways, but we continue to see it as infrastructure. I don't think we see streets. We look out at all of this asphalt, which some of the statistics that NACTO uses, something like 25 to 30% of most downtown land area is in street space. In many cities, 50 to 80% of the municipally owned land is locked up in the public right of way. It's huge. It's a huge expanse of space, which to me, I just continue reminded by wow, this is a lot of territory we're talking about. I did a little back of the envelope math. You add up how much roadway areas in the United States, it's greater than the 4 smallest states in the United States combined. So if we talk about the street having the geography, no duh, it's a lot of space. But what that says is wow, the potential there. When we think about the problems that we have, where we have park poor neighborhoods and no readily available land to buy new parks, what about all that excess asphalt? When we think about climate change and urban heat island and all of these areas that have urban heat island in part because they don't have trees, because they were redlined, what about planting some things in the public right of way? To me, the big aha moment is to just see the space as something that's at play in solving the problems that we have in the city, because it's a vast, vast area, much of which has been way over designed in the United States. And much of it could be reclaimed for other things, I think in many places without significant loss even to vehicular. Look at many of our big boulevards and the capacity of the roadway relative to the flow. So that's the kind of aha moment for me that, wow, our cities could be so different if places just did a little bit more of what some of these cities did. And as profound as that stuff was for me, in many of these streets, it was always a small proportion of the total number of streets, but the potential is just enormous.
So what's the solution? What do you think is the way forward? How should we use your book to continue the good work that happened during the pandemic and after it?
For me, at least, but I think for other people too, the equity issues still remain something of a conundrum. How do we balance all these competing priorities? I mean, I wrote this book before 2025, and now all of a sudden we're like the shift of a conversation about equity again. But cities are trying to think about their streets in terms of fairness. And so I hope that people use my book to try to think through and resolve what can seem like contradictions that are hard to reconcile, either conceptually or practically. And I hope that it helps them think about how to balance and make choices in their streets. But I also do find that the power of planning is that planners, I always joke with my students, that planning is one of those places where plagiarism is okay. That imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, that I studied 9 cities, but these were just a few of the cities that were doing some of these things. And small towns, big cities, villages were closing alleys to create, like, I'm hoping people use the book to gain inspiration for what's possible. But I do write it grounded in policy. It's a little like the NACTO manual. It opens up your mind to what's possible, but is grounded in the realities of what's practicable, because you cannot just dream with something as rigidly constructed and regulated as a street. You have to be able to talk the language of design in order to accomplish it. Yeah, I think that if you think of how many millions of square miles of roadway there are in the United States, there's a lot of work that could be done to create really wonderful spaces. It's a messy process, but these cities have paved the way for us, to pardon the bad pun, but I think we can learn a lot from them and the mistakes they made. And I hope we keep the project going. And I hope the book helps people think about that. It was written, it's an academic book, so it has to speak to an academic audience. But I think there are we're having this conversation, there are a lot of literate people passionate about transportation who are a little bit or a lot wonky when it comes to this stuff. And so I'm hoping some of the details that they may enjoy, but even if you're not a transportation wonk, there's stories. There's stories of people trying to do something different and better. And I find that stuff inspirational.
Reclaiming the Road, Mobility Justice Beyond Complete Streets. Where can folks get a copy?
So it is on sale. If you just Google it, you can buy it directly from the University of Minnesota Press, which is a really wonderful press. So happy to publish with them. It can be ordered through many of our local bookstores. I think a lot of local bookstores are tied in with the University of Minnesota Press. And so if City Lights Bookstore is your local bookstore, or Powell's, and you can go there, hopefully find it on the shelf, or you can order it through them. And yes, wherever else you buy books, or your local library.
Yeah. And where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
So here at Miami University, again, the power of Google, Department of Geography. I'll give you my email, which is prythed, D as in David, L at miamioh.edu. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm also on Instagram as Landscape Geographer is my handle there. So yeah, those are some of the places where you can find me. We're out walking the streets or biking the streets of Oxford, Ohio, or arguing with my city engineer why we should build a bike lane here or there or close an alley.
Awesome. Well, David, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Well, I so appreciate what you do, Jeff. Like, you're an aggregator of information, and I really love reading the overhead wire and knowing what's going on. So happy to have another wonderful conversation.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters who support this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. You can support the show as always by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Sign up for our almost 20-year-old newsletter as well by visiting theoverheadwire.com, or check out the show notes for merch or other opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.